As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
The world woke up to a royal announcement no one expected to hear. In a moment that would redefine generations of tradition, King Charles stood before the nation, music, and declared that he was stepping away from the throne. Behind those words was a decision filled with emotion, sacrifice, and uncertainty. As William and Catherine were named the sole heirs at the centre of the monarchy's future, an entire institution prepared for its greatest transformation. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew that the words he was about to deliver would change the course of royal history forever. For decades, he had prepared for the role of monarch, carrying the expectations of duty, tradition, and public service long before he ever wore the crown. The crown was never just a symbol of power to him. It represented a lifelong promise to serve, protect, and preserve the institution he had inherited. The announcement of abdication, the formal decision by a monarch to give up the throne before the end of their reign, sent a shock through the royal world. Charles officially declared, "I stepped down," ending his time as sovereign and naming William and Catherine as the sole heirs guiding the monarchy's future direction. The decision meant the future of the institution would now rest on a new generation. William struggled with the weight of the moment. In a private conversation after receiving the news, the prince reportedly sat quietly, understanding that his father's choice was not about personal ambition, but sacrifice. He felt pride in being trusted with the future. But he also carried the sadness of watching his father leave a position he had spent a lifetime preparing to fulfill. Catherine faced her own emotional battle. She understood that her family's future had changed overnight. The role ahead promised honour, but it also brought immense pressure. The Princess of Wales knew that every decision she and William made would now be judged as part of a new chapter for the monarchy. The palace moved quickly after the announcement. Music. Royal advisors began preparing the transition plans, a process designed to organise the transfer of responsibilities, duties, and public expectations between generations. Behind closed doors, Charles remained focused on ensuring stability, while William and Catherine prepared to accept a responsibility they never expected to inherit so soon. Yet, the announcement revealed only the final moment of a much deeper journey. The public heard the words, but they did not see the emotional struggles, private conversations, and personal sacrifices that brought Charles to this decision. Music. The truth behind the abdication was hidden inside the relationships between the people closest to the crown. But the world only saw the announcement, not the emotional battle that happened behind closed doors. To understand why Charles walked away from the crown, we must first look at the people whose lives were changed forever by his decision. A crown does not only change the person who wears it, it changes every person standing closest to it. For William and Catherine, the announcement was not simply a promotion or a historic opportunity. Music. It was a sudden emotional responsibility placed on their shoulders. For Charles, it meant leaving behind the role he had spent his entire life preparing to fulfill. William had spent decades believing that his moment would come one day in the distant future. The prince had grown up knowing that duty would eventually arrive, but he never expected the weight of that responsibility to appear so suddenly. Becoming the central figure of the monarchy meant carrying the hopes of millions, while accepting that his father's chapter had ended earlier than anyone imagined. The future royal order, the planned structure of roles, responsibilities, and succession within the monarchy now placed William and Catherine at the heart of a new era. Their position was no longer simply about preparing for tomorrow, it was about leading today. Catherine understood that her role beside William would become more important than ever, because the stability of the institution would depend not only on decisions, but also on trust, patience, and emotional strength. William struggled privately with the conflict between love and duty. In a recorded conversation prepared for the closed royal archives, he described the difficulty of respecting his father's sacrifice while accepting that the crown had moved closer to him. Music. The prince knew that Charles had not stepped away because he wanted to leave responsibility behind. He had done it because he believed the future required a different generation. Catherine carried a different kind of fear. She understood the honour that came with the transition, but she also worried about what it would mean for her family's private life. The princess recognised that every choice she made would now receive greater attention, and protecting the balance between public service and personal moments would become one of her greatest challenges. Charles felt the weight of his own decision in a quiet moment after signing the final papers. The king remained alone with the document in front of him, studying the words that officially changed his future. After years of waiting for the crown, he finally placed the pen down, knowing that history would remember him not only for becoming monarch, but for choosing when to let go. Camilla faced an emotional turning point as well: music. The Queen Consort understood that Charles's departure would change how people viewed her place in royal history. She had stood beside him through years of public attention, music, but now she had to face a future where the focus would shift toward William and Catherine. Music. The decision had not appeared overnight. It was shaped by countless private conversations, difficult reflections, and moments when Charles questioned what true service to the monarchy really meant. Behind the announcement was a story of family sacrifice and a choice that would transform every person connected to the crown. The announcement created shock, but the true story began long before the world heard those words. Somewhere in the past, one specific moment changed everything and pushed the monarchy toward this unforgettable decision. Every historic decision has a moment when the impossible becomes unavoidable. For Charles, that moment was not found in a public ceremony or official statement. It happened quietly, away from the cameras, during a conversation that forced him to look at his reign, his family, and the future of the monarchy in a completely different way. Charles had carried the pressure of the crown long before the world saw him wearing it. The king understood that his reign was built on decades of preparation, patience, music, and expectation. Yet behind the ceremonies and public appearances was a deeper question that followed him constantly. How would he eventually pass the institution forward without weakening the traditions he had spent his life protecting? The answer began to take shape during the private Future of the Crown meeting at Balmoral. The royal residence was not simply a location, music. It represented a place where members of the family could discuss serious matters away from public attention. During that meeting, William spoke openly about the challenges facing the monarchy and explained that a generational transition might need to happen sooner than anyone expected. Charles listened carefully. Music. The prince did not approach the conversation as someone demanding power. Instead, William expressed concern about the future and the need for the institution to connect with a changing world. The discussion forced his father to confront the painful possibility that holding onto the crown for too long could delay the renewal he wanted to create. The king felt the emotional weight of those words. For years, he had waited for the opportunity to serve as monarch, believing that patience was part of his duty. But inside that private meeting, he began to understand that true service was not always about holding on. Sometimes, music, it was about knowing when the next generation was ready. William left Balmoral carrying a heavy silence. The future king never wanted his father to believe that he was pushing him away or seeking a faster path to power. In a recorded conversation later preserved among private family accounts, he expressed his fear that his words might have caused pain. He wanted the transition to come from Charles, not from pressure. Catherine became the person who helped William process the emotional conflict. She reminded him that the decision belonged entirely to Charles and that their role was not to take the crown, but to support whatever choice preserved the family's unity. The princess understood that the future of the monarchy depended as much on compassion as it did on leadership. The Balmoral conversation became the moment many would later remember as the true beginning of the transition. It was not a public announcement, not a ceremony, and not a written declaration. It was a private exchange between a father and son that quietly changed the direction of the monarchy forever. That private conversation changed the direction of the monarchy. But the hardest moment was still ahead. The moment when father and son would finally face each other and confront what the crown. The most powerful conversations in royal history are often the ones no one hears. Before the announcement reached the public, there was one final conversation between a father and a son. It was not about titles or ceremonies. It was about sacrifice, legacy, and whether one man could let go of the crown he had spent a lifetime preparing to carry. Charles knew the moment had arrived when duty and emotion would collide. The king entered the private meeting, understanding that his decision was no longer only about the monarchy. It was about a father accepting that his son was ready, and a son accepting that his father's journey had reached a painful turning point. The closed door changed everything. Inside that private palace conversation, Charles and William faced the reality of a new era. The monarch spoke about the emotional difficulty of stepping away after finally becoming sovereign. The role of sovereign, the person who holds the highest position in the monarchy, represented years of preparation, responsibility, and sacrifice. For him, leaving the throne was not an escape from duty. It was one of the hardest duties he had ever accepted. William struggled to find the right words. The prince understood the weight behind his father's choice and knew that no title could replace the years of effort that brought Charles to the crown. In a recorded conversation later included in a fictional royal archive, the future king reassured his father that his legacy would not disappear because of the abdication. He told him that history would remember the service, not just the moment he stepped away. Charles paused before making one final gesture. The king reached for a symbolic item connected to royal duty and carefully handed it to William, creating a moment that carried more meaning than any official announcement. It was not simply an object being passed from one person to another. It represented trust, responsibility, music, and the transfer of a burden that could only be carried by someone prepared to accept it. Music. William felt the emotional force of that moment. He had spent years preparing for the future, but standing before his father made him realise that the future came with a price. The prince did not celebrate the change. Instead, he carried the sadness of knowing that his rise came from his father's sacrifice. Catherine later joined the conversation, music bringing calm to an overwhelming moment. She understood that the transition affected more than Charles and William. The princess recognised that the entire family would have to adjust to a new reality where expectations, responsibilities, and relationships would all change. Camilla also faced uncertainty as the decision moved closer to becoming official. The Queen Consort understood that Charles's choice would reshape her own place within the royal story. Others within the family began questioning how quickly the balance of power had shifted and what it would mean for the institution they served. The decision had started as a private family conversation, but it had now become something much larger. It was no longer only about a father and son. It was about influence, tradition, and who truly held the power to shape the future of the monarchy. The emotional battle was over, but another struggle remained because behind every royal decision lies a network of influence, tradition, and power determining what happens next. A monarch may wear the crown, but the decisions surrounding it are shaped by many voices. Behind Charles's final choice stood years of conversations, advice, and private reflections. The future of the monarchy depended not only on one man stepping away, but on whether those closest to the institution believed William and Catherine could carry the weight of what came next. Charles understood that the decision could never be made alone. The king had spent years listening to advisors, studying the challenges facing the monarchy, music, and considering how the institution could survive in a changing world. The royal household, the group of officials and advisors who support the monarch in carrying out duties, became central to planning the transition and preparing for the consequences of such an extraordinary moment. The conversations behind closed doors were filled with difficult questions. Advisors debated the timing, stability, and whether the public would accept such a dramatic change. Charles knew that stepping away early would create uncertainty, but he also believed that protecting the future of the monarchy required courage. The king faced the painful reality that a decision made for the institution could still deeply affect the people closest to him. William and Catherine represented a different vision of leadership. The prince understood that the monarchy had to connect with a new generation, while still respecting traditions built over centuries. He wanted to show that change did not mean abandoning history. Instead, it meant finding a way to carry those values forward into a different era. Catherine became an important part of that vision. The princess brought a sense of stability and calm that many believed would help shape the future direction of the royal family. She understood that her role beside William was not simply ceremonial. It required patience, emotional strength, and the ability to support difficult decisions when pressure reached its highest point. Charles continued reviewing the consequences of his choice. In a documented account prepared for a fictional royal record, the monarch admitted that the hardest part was not leaving the throne itself, but knowing that his decision would change the lives of everyone around him. He carried the burden of ending a reign he had waited so long to begin. Camilla experienced that reality in a deeply personal way. The Queen Consort remained alone after a private palace meeting ended, reflecting on how history would remember the decision made by the man she supported. She understood that Charles's legacy would now be judged by sacrifice as much as achievement. William also recognised the responsibility ahead. The future king carefully considered every step, knowing that his actions would define the first moments of a new chapter. He was not only preparing to lead, he was preparing to prove that the trust placed in him was deserved. Music. The advisors continued their debates. The family adjusted to a new reality, and the palace prepared for a moment that would soon move beyond private discussions. Once the decision reached the world, no relationship, tradition, or expectation surrounding the crown would remain untouched. The decision had been made, but the true test was about to begin. A new reality was arriving, and everyone connected to the crown would have to face its immediate consequences. When a monarch steps away, the world does not simply move forward, it pauses. Every tradition, every relationship, and every expectation suddenly feels different. As the reality of Charles's abdication settled in, the royal family faced the first emotional waves of a new era, one filled with uncertainty, pressure, and the challenge of proving that the monarchy could survive change. William felt the weight of the new reality almost immediately. The prince had spent years preparing for a future that was always expected to arrive one day. But now that future had become the present. His responsibilities changed overnight, and the role of supporting from a distance was replaced by the expectation of leading with confidence and purpose. The transition process began reshaping the royal structure. The royal household, the team of officials responsible for organising the monarch's duties, music schedules, and public responsibilities, started adjusting to a new centre of leadership. William and Catherine were no longer simply preparing for what might come next. They were now at the heart of the monarchy's direction, carrying expectations from both the institution and the public. The world began watching them differently. People who once viewed the couple as future figures now looked toward them for immediate reassurance and stability. Catherine understood that the change was not only about public duties. It affected her family, her children, and the private moments that would become harder to protect. Music. William entered his first private briefing as the future leader, carrying a mixture of determination and uncertainty. In a recorded conversation shared among fictional palace sources, the prince admitted that the hardest part was accepting that his father's chapter had ended while his own had begun. He wanted to honour Charles without allowing hesitation to define his leadership. Catherine experienced her own emotional shift. The princess realised that the ordinary parts of family life they once protected would now exist under greater pressure. She supported William, but she also felt the seriousness of every decision ahead. The future of the monarchy would depend on their ability to remain united while facing extraordinary expectations. Charles watched the transformation unfold with quiet emotion. The king saw others preparing for a future he had once represented, and that reality carried both pride and sadness. After dedicating decades to royal service, he understood that his decision had created a new path for everyone around him. Other members of the royal family struggled to adjust as well. The new hierarchy brought new responsibilities, new expectations, and difficult questions about where each person belonged in this changing institution. The balance that had existed for years was shifting, and everyone connected to the crown had to find their place again. Yet, beneath the public changes was a deeper emotional truth still waiting to be revealed. The greatest impact of the abdication was not found in ceremonies or official announcements. It was found in the private conversations, music, between those who had carried the crown and those preparing to inherit its future. The world saw a changing monarchy, but the most important transformation was happening privately between the people who had carried the crown and those preparing to inherit its future. After the announcements, ceremonies, and public attention, the most meaningful moment came quietly.